Dr. Jordan Peterson. Dr. Gad Saad. Book, The Parasitic Mind. Your book concentrates a lot on infectious ideas on the left. I got really interested in Germany 30s 40s, the infectious ideas that possessed the entire country and the devastating consequence of that. So the infectious can emerge across political spectrum, certainly on the right. But the book is almost solely on the ideological excesses of the left. I focused in the ideas of the left because this is not a political book, rather the academia, that's my environment. So the idea pathogens that are most likely to proliferate are the one being spawned by leftist professors. It doesn't mean that the right can't be parasitized. I just focused on the idea pathogens that define my daily reality. I can understand that. I haven't felt the pressure of right-wing conspiratorial theories in relationship with my work. But I started to talk about political ideas because of the consequences of left-wing ideological thinking in the academy. So I got called a right-wing, even a Nazi. So when I objected to the excesses of the left, who sprang to my defenses, tended to logically to come from the right. And there were tendrils feelers out of from the radical right, to see if I was a radical right as well. So, you tend to think better of people when they come to your defense. So, it's hard to keep your centrist bearings, when you go after one side of the political equation. Because you're befriended by the feelers of that side. So, you think you shifted more towards the right? I don't think so. Because I truly don't believe in an all-encompassing label that defines my political positions. In both our conservative position. Example. Open door policy, I'm quite conservative. Or, predatory serial pedo, I have no moral restraint in the idea of executing someone who's raped 5 children. Social issues, extremely socially liberal, and quite progressive. So, my try bits, examining each individual issue and then propose a base of universal foundational principles. It's not at all that the right cannot be parasitized. Like anti-scientific reasoning. When it comes to rejection of evolution, the people on the right tend to reject evolution. And people on the left reject more evolutionary arguments, like sex differences. So each party has its own anti-scientific lenses and myopia. Conspiratorial theories and paranoid theories are propagating on the right. Like QAnon. It's popular and pervasive. And Trump's claims to have won the election are supported by a network of conspiratorial thinking. Trump's claims that he won the election, and to believe that, you have to believe the electoral system in USA is broken to the degree that fraud is widespread and pervasive, of sufficient magnitude to move an election. Believe that people as Mike Pence have become part of that network. Believe that the judiciary in USA, who ruled like 60 times against his claims, and 1 time in favor, believe that it's become uncontrollably corrupt, even on the Republicans, that were nominated by Trump. And believe that the only person standing on moral high ground has been Trump. But, there's a lot of support that Trump won the election. So, someone reading your book, especially a leftist, would say, not only you are concentrating on the wrong side of the equation regards to clear and present danger, but the omission of conspiratorial thinking on the right shows a blind spot that threaten the stability of society. Because I have felt as an academic that the greatest threat to my freely scientific inquiry has come from the left. But conspiratorial think is on the increase on the right. Our ability to believe nonsense using a psychometric scale. So I think your question is, the capacity for people to think in non-critical ways is not restricted to political aisle. Both sides can be parasitized. I talk about it in chapter 6. Coined as ostrich parasitic syndrome is something that all people can succumb to. Even being highly educated and intelligent does not inoculate you from these cognitive distortions, irrational ways of thinking. As I spawn, all of this nonsense are typically by professors. I hope that people don't read the book as though it is a political treatise. It's just that's the ecosystem that I reside in. You are a biologically oriented thinker. Talk about ideas as analogous to life forms. So what buys you, in terms of explanatory power? It contextualizes the fact that many people slowly walk into the abyss of infinite lunacy. Let me give you a couple of analogies. The spider wasp, look for a spider to sting. Rendering it zombified, it's still alive, it then carries this much larger spider into its burrow. While the spider it's alive but zombified, it lays an egg and then the offspring will eat the spider. I argue that political correctness is akin to the spider wasp's sting, it zombifies us, complicit in our silence, leading us to the burrow of infinite lunacy. A form equivalent of what happens in biological systems. About parasitic ideas. In neuroparasitology, study how a particular parasite will end up in the brain of its host, altering its neural circuitry. The host will engage in behaviors that are maladaptive to it, but adaptive to the parasite. My point was, why do people hold on and get infected by these alluring parasitic ideas? I realize the neuroparasitological framework is ideal to explain why supposedly rational people could completely become parasitized by insanity. Like how the LGBTQ+ become in favor of queers for Palestine, but down Zionist pigs. That sound parasitic. Now that it's not embraced with infinite warmth. So, parasite takes over a host, the parasite can replicate, has an interest in the outcome. I guess you're presupposing, like Dawkins, that ideas compete in a Darwinian fashion. Those that are better at taking over their hosts are the ones that propagate. The difference between a mimetic approach and the approach I take in the book is twofold. One, memes can be negatively violence, neutral or positive. Like if I sang jingle, you might hum it. So my mimetic jingle has now infected your brain. So the memes can be all possible options. Whereas the parasitic idea passages that I'm speaking of are stating that only they are negative. 2. Mimetic framework operates as their viral. Pathogens can be viruses, bacteria, parasites. So I called idea pathogens, which are viral infection or parasitic infestation. It's a nuances between my approach and Dawkins. So a parasite tends to make a host act that aren't that good for the host. It seems to me, that's potentially where the metaphor breaks down. Because it also seems that people who are pushing these ideas forward actually gain as a consequence. They're working for the same purposes as the parasite. People who are pushing a given ideological/theoretical position benefit from pushing that position, as a consequence of the effects it has on their success within their broad community. No, I would look at it as parasitizing of your mind result in the proliferation of the idea pathogen. It doesn't care about your reproductive fitness. Example, Islamophobia. As an Islamic supremacist, if I want the West to become more Islamic, spreading Islamophobia as a narrative is very good. I could convince a lot of people of intelligentsia that it's Islamophobia to criticize anything about Islam. Is Islamophobia, memeplex Dawkins' term, or idea pathogen, mine? If I can parasitize enough minds to repeat this, then that is Islamophobia memeplex, by its spreading from brain to brain has an ultimate goal of creating greater Islamization of the West. I don't care about the reproductive fitness of the humanities professor who is spreading that Islamophobia idea pathogen. Yeah, but it might be to your benefit if you actually did enhance the function of your host. If by being parasitized by the idea pathogen it improves the reproductive fitness of the host. Yes, but in this situation the academic status of the host, because the ideas could be spread more rapidly, certainly does. So we can create an echo chamber where we could spread that idea pathogen more readily. That's perfect. But the reality, I like more the term parasitic, rather than mimetic. Back to the queers to Palestine. By having someone from the LGBT community fighting against Islamophobia and against the Zionist pigs, it's actually detrimental to my reproductive fitness, my survival. Being a member of LGBT and standing up for a system that would be brutal and repressing me is not exactly a good rational strategy to pursue. And yet I pursue it because I have been infected by a parasitic idea pathogen. But it doesn't explain to me exactly the motivation for putting the idea forward. The idea isn't literally hijacking the nervous system of its host, in the same way the parasitic wasp does. There's no direct connection between the ideas and the motivations of the host. I'm striving to understand that. In a sense the parasitic wasp is causing neuronal alteration, that causes the spider to become zombified, you're right. But ultimately everything that we do, even ideas, could be translated to neuronal firings. Yes, hopefully you'll be able to specify that mechanism. But opens to the problem. What do you see in the continual debate between right and left? Might be construed in terms that you're using as a constant battle between proponents of the claim that one set of ideas is parasitical, while the other set isn't. Like people who object to a biological definition of sex, or gender. Will say, that person has been parasitized by an idea in your parlance. I think it's actually close to the claim that is made. So the true motivation for the claim is something operating behind the scenes. That the person claims are bolstering their position of power, maintaining their status, putting down other group. But mostly for maintaining the status quo within they have an interest. They are not putting an idea that has any objective validity, but being possessed by an idea that has function similar that the one you're describing. So how do you protect the critical game, where ideas are assessed from degenerating into claim and counterclaim? Nothing but competing, or nothing but parasites. Be more charitable in attributing a cause to the people who originally spawned those idea pathogens. Like, Post-Modernism would be the granddaddy of all idea pathogens. Cultural relativism, identity politics, biophobia, militant feminism, critical race theory. Each are an idea pathogen. They might manifest themselves and project different trajectories. There's some conciliant commonality across all the ideas. So what these idea pathogens have in common? Here's where I'm going to be charitable. These idea pathogens come off from a noble place. Desire to pursue a noble cause. But, regrettably in the pursuit, they end up meaning the proponents of those idea pathogens end up willing to murder truth in the service of pursuing that otherwise noble goal. Like, equity feminism. Men and women should be equal under law. Shouldn't be sexism or misogyny, against one sex or the other. Sexes, to be open up to equal exploitation. Everyone has something to offer. And only a fool would want to restrict half the population from offering what they have to offer. Even if it's self-interest. Absolutely. The problem arises when militant feminists comes and argue in the service of that original goal. The desire to squash the patriarchy and status quo. We must espouse a position that rejects the possibility that man and women are distinguishable from one another. Not better, not worse. But there is evolutionary trajectory that would have resulted in recurring sex differences that are fully explained by biology and evolution. While militant feminist will reject that. and hence they'll suffer from biophobia and other idea pathogen, in the service of that original noble goal. Or cultural relativism. That there are no human universals, each culture has to be identified based on its own merits. Starts with the kernel of truth. Franz Boas, the first who espoused this idea, was trying to stop the possibility that people might use biology in explaining differences between cultures and so on, and justify them that way. The biologist would say this is how it is and therefore that's how it should be. Exactly. It the original noble goal. End up building edifices of evidence for the next 100 years, where the word biology is never uttered. Like, I go to see our human nature in a business context, and we never mention biology. So how you could study all these purposes of important behaviors, without recognizing that humans might be privy to their hormonal fluctuations? To me it's a trivially obvious statement. But for economists this is hearsay. Boas, start with a noble goal, and then metamorphosize into complete lunacy, in the service of that original noble goal. Idea pathogen, arise, from a kernel of truth, noble goal, and then metamorphosize into BS. Other way to see parasite. Academy has built up a reputation. Is like a storehouse of value. Trade equitably to people. Relatively assured in the future. You will be invited to trade. And academia in principle or the intellectual exercise has built up a reservoir of goodwill. That people will pay to go to be educated. That the cost is justifiable. Because it had actual practical relevance. Like the development of technology. Pure scientific research. So other ideas come along, that don't have the same functional utility, but have the same appearance. They parasitize the individual, and the system. They build a reputation offering solutions of pragmatic utility. Even training students to think clearly has tremendous economic value if you do it appropriately. Operate more efficiently. Once it has all of that, can be mimicked by systems that perform the same functions putatively, but don't have the same history of demonstrating practical utility. Like the idea of peer review. Work in science, because there's a scientific method, and say how was adhered to a search program. And you can translate it into, let's say sociology, and mimic the academic writing style that's characteristic of the sciences, and make the claims that in the surface seems that were generated using the same technologies. But all it is effaced. It's that level where the parasitic metaphor seems to be most appropriate. Great point. Two things to mention. One, I reside in a business school. The idea pathogen that I discuss in the book have simply not proliferated in the business and engineering school, for the exactly reasons that you began to talk before. Because those disciplines are coupled with reality. I can't build a good economic model using postmodernist economics. I cannot build an econometric model of consumer choice that works, using feminist glaciology. So it's harder from their epistemology to be parasitized by the idea pathogen. This brings the questions about what constitutes a claim to truth. I tend to adopt a pragmatic theory of truth. Means that your theory predicts the consequences of a set of actions in the world. If you take those set of actions, and that consequence emerges, then your theory is true enough. Demonstrated its validity within that set of predictions. At least it's true enough to have predicted that outcome. So, in engineering and business. In engineering, when you build a bridge there's a simple question. Does the bridge stand up to the load it needs to be resistant to? If it's yes, your theory is good enough to build that bridge. In business is the same. That your idea can be killed very rapidly. Helps to see if that idea is valid or isn't. So the most adherent to scientific methodology, the more resistance they have to these parasitic ideas. So we should go over again exactly what those ideas are. Like postmodernism. Postmodernism starts with the tenet that there is no objective truth. We are shackled by subjectivity, by a wide range of biases. So the argue about absolute truths is silly. Also seem to claim they're very concerned with the effect that language has on defining reality, and have come to the conclusion, mostly French, that reality is defined in totality by language. There's no getting outside of the language. Deconstructionism, language creates reality. Right, it's a weak theory. It doesn't abide by his own principles. Derrida says that, act as if, and also explicitly claims that power exists. So if you're building realities with language, why would you do that? And the answer for the postmodernists is that it's power. That's a quasi-Marxism. So a postmodernist agrees with that definition? Yes, the problem though is that postmodernism allows for a complete breakdown of reality as understood by a 3-year-old. I refer it in my book as intellectual terrorism. I compare postmodernism to the 911 hijackers' planes going onto buildings. I argue that postmodernists fly buildings of BS into our edifices of reason. Because, let me tell you stories that I had with postmodernists. In 2002, one of my doctoral students had defended his dissertation, and we were going for celebratory dinner. Me, my wife, him, his date. He told me that his date is a graduate student in cultural anthropology, radical feminism and postmodernist. The holy trinity of BS. He kinda told me that to be in my best behavior. Don't worry. But I couldn't resist trying to at least get a sense of what her positions were. I said, you are a postmodernist. Yes. I'm an evolutionary psychologist. I believe there are humans universals that serve as kind of a bedrock of similarities that we share. Do you mind if I propose what I consider to be human universal, and tell why that's the case? Go for it. Is it not the case that within Homo sapiens, only women bear children? Is that not a human universal? She scoffs. Absolutely not true that only women bear children. There's a Japanese tribe that men bear children. So for you restricting the conversation to the biological realm, you keep us barefoot and pregnant. So, let me take a less controversial example. Is it not true from any vantage point on Earth, sailors since time immemorial have relied on the premises that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? She used the language creates reality. What do you mean by east and west? Those are arbitrary labels, and the sun, I might call it, dancing hyena. I said, the dancing hyena rises in the east, sets in the west. She said, I don't play those label games. That's why I talk a lot about this. She wasn't a psychiatric patient who escaped from psychiatric institute. She was aping what postmodernists espouse to their thousands of students. When we can't agree that only women bear children, east and west exist, and the sun, then it's intellectual terrorism. Yes, let's talk about other examples. Postmodernism, reality is constituted by language. Yes, it's allied to another idea pathogen. Social constructivism on asteroids. The idea that we are prone to socialization, no serious science, will disagree with that. And that is an important force in shaping who we are. And that language shapes our conception of reality. So the issue is degree. Exactly, and hence the steroid part. Is where you argue that everything that we are is due to social constructivism. Right, it's the collapse of a multivariate scenario into a univariate scenario, inappropriate collapse. Like your point with Cathy Newman. About multifactorial. She argues that everything related to gender gap must be due to misogyny. And the reality is that there might be 17 other factors with greater explanatory power that explains why we're there. But she can't see the world in a multifactorial way. This might have bearing on the attractiveness of certain sets of ideas. That a scientific explanation should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's an Occam's razor. You want to a good theory buys you a lot, and buys you as much as possible. So you only have to learn a limited number of principles and you can explain a very large number of phenomena. But there's the attraction of the inappropriate collapse of the complex into its simplified counterpart. Whereby you rid yourself of complicity that's actually necessary and inevitable. Means that you couldn't make progress employing your theory in a pragmatic way. But if you don't test it, that it could be killed, you'll never find that out. Chapter in my new book. Abandon ideology. It's very tempting to collapse the world, that only one explanatory mechanism can account for everything. Where intellectual persons generate plausible causal hypotheses. So you can take power or sexuality or status, love, hate or resentment. And generate a theory that account for virtually everything. Relying only on one of those factors. So, is it the attractiveness of that simplification that accounts for the attractiveness of these parasitic ideas? Finding a simpler explanation rather than a complex one is associated with the idea of Gerd Gigerenzer. Idea of fast and frugal heuristics. Pragmatic theory says that economist thinks that before we choose a given car, we engage in laborious calculations because we're seeking to maximize our utility. That's a beautiful normative theory. But consumers actually don't do that. We don't look at all available options on all available attributes. We couldn't, too many. We used a simplifying strategy. But the downside of that, sometimes we apply a fast and frugal heuristic when we shouldn't have done so. For certain complex phenomena, my innate passion to want to seek that one causal mechanism is suboptimal. So differentiated. When to do one of the process is the real challenge. A robust discipline offers a set of implications that are pragmatically useful. So being a developing mastery of those heuristics boost you up the hierarchy. If you become good on that theory that allows you to do more. So it gives you status, authority, power. The postmodernists get rid of the application to the world side of things. So, they have a language game that operates to their principles of reality. They don't care about the constraints of the actual world. Except when that world consists of a struggle for academic power, and endless definitions of reality of a language game. I try to figure out why intellectual person espoused all the nonsense. Let's say I'm a postmodernist. I'm looking with envy at the physicist, mathematicians, etc. getting the glory on the campus. Why aren't we getting attention? So if I create a world of full profundity, where I appear as though telling something meaningful, while I'm only saying gibberish, then my prod can be impenetrable as a physicist. Yes, if you do IQ test among all disciplines, physicists are the smartest. So we have physicist envy. Yes, that's why they've created sub-disciplines of economics that are completely mathematical, but fully devoid from any real-world applications. Just wanted to be accepted on the table of serious scientists. So given that argument, the thinker, that's the parasite. Because he wants to climb the hierarchy, accrue to themselves the meritorious status that a true scientist would have generated. They do that by setting up a false system that looks like one, but doesn't have any real-world practicality, and justify it by eliminating the notion of the real world. Yes, in that case the originator of the parasite is getting reproductive fitness. Also, acting as a parasite on a functional system. And in the top of that, he's allowing ideas to enter his consciousness. And some of those will fulfill the function of producing this flow reality in which he can rise. It's a parasitical set of ideas within a parasitical strategy. And to work, relies on a principle. Fundamental attribution error. That people attributes dispositional traits. Otherwise situational variables or vice versa. So now I'm Jacques Derrida. If I get up in front of an audience, and I espouse a never-ending concatenation of syllables that avoids semantic meaning, but sound extraordinary profound, then the audience can say, I don't understand what you're talking about, because I'm too dumb and he's very profound. Or, I don't understand what are you saying, because he's a charlatan who's engaging in profundity. So people chose the first one. It's complicated, like, I can't read physics papers in physics journals, so I can't evaluate them. But most of the time if I read a book and don't understand it, I believe that the author hasn't made it clear. Like when I read Lacan and Derrick. What you are saying, it's not that I'm stupid, it's that you're playing a game. You had enough self-confidence in your cognitive abilities that you didn't succumb to their fundamental attribution sleight of hand. But, most people audience didn't come to your conclusion. And they maybe also didn't have a good alternative. When I started my career and read that I could learn that particular language game was valid, and that was the only route to success. Like the postmodernists that I encounter, they have none exposure to biology as a science. Anything about evolutionary theory. Yes, and most social scientists think that biology is some Nazi thing. Also psychology, but has managed to steer clear the worst excesses of this degeneration/abandonment of pragmatic necessity. That these subdisciplines have been rooted in biology being a corrective. In my first book I try to explain how you can apply evolutionary thinking to understand our consummatory nature. I gave the same talk to two different audiences on the University of Michigan. The first day to the psychology department, they loved it. The second day, the same talk, to the business school, but because they were so bereft of biological-based thinking, I couldn't get a sentence. That consumers are driven by biological mechanisms. My experience with the theorizers of business couldn't necessarily produce a business. Yes, when I do my talks with business practitioners it's well received. When I do talks to business school professors, depended on how vested they are in their paradigms, either goes well or not. Because there's a practical problem. One is contending with the actual world, biological necessity. Second, the world of sociological necessity, the fact that you need to be with others while you solve your biological problems. So you can be a postmodernist, believe that there's nothing in the world except language. As long as the university is nested in a system that's dealing with the world well enough to feed you. Other problem, it's the DI religion. DI, it's the acronym for diversity, inclusion and equity. Has proliferated with much greater alacrity in academia. So when you apply for a grant, you have to have a DI statement. That says, what you did in the past to advance the DI causes. If you won the grants, how you'll uphold DI principles. One of our colleagues at McGill was denied a grant, because it didn't matter what was the substantive content of his grant application, the scientific content. He wasn't. So, that's a situation where the elevation of that ideological game has been elevated over the game of science. Science, it's not a game, it's a technique for solving genuine problems. Ethnobotanists. Like the epistemology of how I study the flora or fauna, how I adjudicate scientific issues within that ecosystem. There's no competition between scientific method and indigenous way of knowing. It's only one game. Called scientific method. That's what means knowing, there's only one game. If we use the word knowledge, we're presupposing that is one thing. It's the use of abstractions to predict and control. That is intended to produce the outcome that you desire. The better you are at that, the more knowledge you have. So now the term DI is used to determine who gets a grant. Also used to make the point that there isn't a singular epistemology for seeking truth. Like, there's not a way of knowing. Is irrespective of the identity of the person who is studying. Isn't that what liberates us from the shackles of our personal identity? You can say that. And still say that people use knowledge to obtain power. That's a postmodernism claim. But it's exaggerated, that people only use knowledge to obtain power. And that's all that's worth obtaining. And that's wrong because both are too extreme. But even in science, you can criticize science. By saying scientists are biased and self-interested. And will use their theories to advance themselves in the sociological world. So you can be skeptical about it. But science also have say that. Because we're likely to be blinded. Even when making the most objective claims about reality. So, we will put scientists into verbal competition. Who determine who's playing a straight game. So science can say. Despite the primate nature of the scientific endeavor and the jockeying that goes along with it, there's still a residual that constitutes progressive expansion of the domain of knowledge. 5% of our research findings, 5% improvement in knowledge. Unbelievably rapid rate of knowledge accrual. Facial symmetry is one of the markers that are used when deciding that someone is beautiful in 73 different cultures. We can talk about the nomological network. To demonstrate that something is real, you triangulate. You use more than 3 positions of reference. Like, our senses are nomological network system. So we can say if something it's real. If we see it, taste it, smell it, touch it, and hear it. Each sense relies of different physical phenomena. So they're unlikely to be correlated randomly. We've evolved 5 senses, because it's been our experience evolutionarily. So if you can't identify something with 5 independent dimensions, might be not real. Once we use our 5 sense for something real, we consult with other people to see if all agree on the phenomenon. And if both report the same, and across repeated occasions, probably that thing is real. So, nomological network is the formalization of that idea across measurement techniques in the sciences. Like, sensorial convergence. Women were asked to rate the pleasantness of t-shirt that were worn by men. The most pleasing t-shirt is the one of the guy most symmetric. So, sensorial convergence is when 2 independent senses are arriving at the same final product. Perfect evolutionary sense. Nomological network isn't discussed very frequently. Not talked in books. Nomological network. Triangulated evidence. Establishing the validity of a psychological construct. Convergent and discriminate validity. Multi-trait multi-method, Campbell and Fisk. Develop standards for psychological testing. Method to define what's real. Yes, and it's a different than a pragmatic proof of truth. Because the theory is evaluated with regards to its utility as a tool. And nomological network is an analogy to sensory reality. If something registers across multiple methods of detecting it, 'tis probably real. Detecting it across cultures, space, times, methodologies, paradigms. The granddaddy of nomological network. Validate the veracity of a phenomena. So how do I establish that toy preferences are not singularly socially constructed? Studying primates e.g. So now it's across species, then across cultures, time period. And then look at androgenized vs non-androgenized children. Look across a variation in hormonal status. So, if the data in a box is not sufficient to convince you. So, by building that entire network, I'm going to drown you in a tsunami of evidence. It's not only used for scientific phenomena or evolutionary. By building a nomological network, I could use this grand epistemological tool to tackle important phenomena even if they're outside the realm of science. It's like you are reading into the data, or the data are revealing the pattern. So with one methodology you don't know. So you sue multiple methodologies, and the more separate are in their approach, the better. E.g. in maps of meaning I was looking that patterns of sociologically and in literature were also manifest in psychology and in neuroscience. So, for a dimension of triangulation, if the pattern emerges across these disparate modes of approach, it's probably real. So the psychologists that's biologically informed is going to be richer. Your theory has not only account for behavior, but also in accord with the functions of the brain. And that's the approach that you're taking to analysis of the business problems. And it's a truly liberating way to view the world. So if you have epistemic humility, I simply don't know enough. I haven't built the requisite nomological network to pronounce a definitive position on this. On the other hand, if you ask a question related to my nomological network, I can tell you all the epistemic swagger that I'm afforded by the protection of having building that nomological network. So, I can engage an issue with well-deserved self-assuredness. Or to say I don't know about this topic. And if you establish that epistemic honesty with your students, it's powerful. Because if one student asks something that I don't really know, and say send me an email to see if we can figure it out, that creates trust between those students. He's not pretending to know everything. You define this intellectual subfield as included in this parasitic network, the parasitic rubric. Then, you're left with the question. How do you identify valid theories of knowledge from invalid theories? It seems that postmodernism has to deny biological science. Because keeps producing facts that are incommensurate with the postmodernists. That's why postmodernism disrepute on their intellectual endeavor. If they were honest theorists, we'll take biology into account. So the theories were in accordance with that, rather than just throwing it out the window. Notion of consilience. By E. O. Wilson. Related to nomological network. Put a bunch of things under one explanatory rubric. Operate using a consilient tree of knowledge. Meta-theory mid-level universal phenomena generate hypotheses. So the field becomes very organized. But postmodernist exists in the node of BS. It's unrelated to any consilient tree of knowledge. They could never advance anything. They reward one another, but can't build coherence. Auguste Kekule created a hierarchy of the sciences. He placed sociology at the apex of the sciences. Because it's harder to study the rich complexity of humans within a social system than study the diamond properties. Try to understand postmodernists. All pragmatic disciplines. They're valid enterprises and they need to take each other's findings into account. So that the other various disciplines don't take our findings into account. So they're being just as exclusionary as we are. That's a valid argument? No. There are no useful findings that they've come up with. Are they useful in restructuring society so that's it's fairer? No. That's the claim. Let's make the presumption that these are essentially left-wing theories. It's not the case that the left wing politically has had nothing to offer the improvement of society. Ideas generated by the left that move into the mainstream have made society a more civil place. Like the 8-hour workday, 40-hour work weeks, universal pension, universal health care. Everybody presumes that those things have improved the life of rich and poor alike. I think that's a reasonable claim. So, are the claims of the postmodernists justified by the political effects of their actions? Can you give me a postmodernist nugget that had it not been espoused by a postmodernist, the world would be a poorer place? Whether practically, theoretically, epistemologically. Like, I can do it generally, in the manner that I did. It's part of the domain of the left-wing thought, and it's not reasonable to assume that nothing of any benefit has come out of the domain of left-wing thought. It's general, I'm not pointing to a particular theorem. No one can come with a single example as simple as me just enunciating the value of cognitive behavior therapy. At that level you can't come up with one postmodernist insight. The only insight, it's that we're shackled by subjectivity, our personal biases. That's true, and any human being with a functioning brain could told you that. Well, that kind of criticism has been leveled within field by the practitioners, including by the postmodernist to their field. I would hesitate to say. I would say, if everything's a language game, then why play the postmodernist game? Why has privileged status in the hierarchy of truth claims, if they're nothing more than world that's produced my language? The importance to talk about postmodernism, because it's a fundamental attack on the epistemology of truth. That's right, we need to point that out. Like, once a colleague told me, how come you are such a truth defender and so on? And you're perfectly happy to criticize all these leftist idea pathogens. And yet you're not as critical of Trump's attacks on truth. So, Trump attacks specific truth statements. I'm the better president. Biggest audiences at my rallies, etc. Each can be demonstrably false and lies. They're attacks on a particular truth statement. It is reprehensive. I disagree with any form of lying. But it's a lot less concerning to me than a group that are devoted to attacking the epistemology of truth. Define the epistemology of truth. Is a way of tackling truth. The nomological networks. Is a way of adjudicating between competing statements as to what is true or not. So the scientific method are ways to which we've agreed that that's the epistemology by which we create core knowledge and then build that front. There are degrees of assault on truth. And the more fundamental the axiom that you're assaulting, the more dangerous your assault will be. So, the non-postmodernist claim, like the Enlightenment claim, I think it's grounded beyond religions, probably in biology itself. There's an objective world, there's a knowable reality, that multiple people can have access to. But our biases and limitations intellectually and physiologically, make it difficult for us to know it. There's a method by which we can overcome that. Is the nomological method. Multiple lines of evidence derived from multiple sources, time, etc. That enables us to determine what that objective reality is. Predict and control things for our benefit. And the postmodern attack is on all of that. Everything. So now you might agree that it's not harsh for me to say that they're intellectual terrorists. They put these little bombs of BS that blow the nomological network. That blows the epistemology of truth. And you go beyond that on your book. They put forward that theory in order to benefit from being theorists. They ratchet themselves up their intellectual hierarchies. Gain the status and power that goes along with that. And the fact that damage the entire system of knowledge itself is irrelevant. They considered it as collateral damage. So they're willing to sacrifice the entire game of truth-seeking to the promotion of their own individual carriers within the language hierarchy that they've built. And I think you revealed another point. The distinction between deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics. Deontological ethics. If I say, it is always wrong to lie, that's an absolute statement. If I say, it's okay to lie if I'm trying to spare my spouse's feelings, that's a consequential statement. It turns out that the one who espouse those parasitic idea pathogens are engaging their consequentialist ethical system. They're saying, if I murder truth in the service of this more important noble social justice goal, so be it. Whereas if you're an absolutist deontological, you're positing an objective reality even in the domain of ethics. That's another place where postmodern fails. It can't help but refer to things outside of the language game. So by relying on consequentialist ethics, and that the postmodernists tend to be consequentialists, and their emphasis on hurt feelings is an indication of that. Because there's no objective reality, you can't sacrifice people's feelings or lived experience to any claim about objective reality. But by doing that they elevate the subjective to the position of ultimate authority. Maybe that's the driving motivation. The desire to elevate the subjective to omniscience. In the book I talk about the field of operations research, where you try to put in axiomatic form the objective function that you're trying to maximize or minimize. Like, I worked on two-dimensional cutting stock problem. If you have rectangles of metal and you get an order to produce 20 x by y subsheets within that broader metal, how should I do the cut as to minimize the waste of metal? So operations research is applied in when you try to minimize the queue time that consumers wait, or maximize profits. So applied mathematics field to solve real-world problems. Now, in the old days the objective function of the university was maximize intellectual growth, human knowledge. Today is predicated on the idea that there was genuine knowledge. A difference between forms of knowledge. Some more valid than others. So that's part of the claim that you can have knowledge at all. Exactly. As now the function is minimize hurt feelings. Or maximize learning whilst minimizing hurt feelings. I wouldn't mind that so much if the claim that feelings were ultimately real, were made tangible. At least we'd have a reality that was outside of words. But you can't say that the world is a construct of words. And at the same time, but there's nothing more real than my subjective feelings. Like, I kinda sympathized. I believe that pain seems really real to me. And it's fundamentally subjective. And what we consider ethical behavior is to minimize pain given its fundamental reality. It's not like I believe subjective feelings are real and important, but I'm willing to claim that there is such a thing as real, important, and true. So it's logically coherent for me to make that claim. It's the incoherence of the claims that bothers me. So we should sum up to some degree. So, we talk about ideas as parasites. Unraveling what parasite might mean. A two-strata model. One, parasitical behavior of the theorist, who puts a theory that mimics a practically useful theory, to accrue to themselves goods that have been produced by theories that have broad practical utility. Two, parasitical ideas that serves that function for the person who's using it in a parasitical way. Postmodern ideas as examples of that. We haven't tied together the idea of why has it happened that the ontological and epistemological claims of the postmodernists aid and abet the parasitical function. Why they take the shape they actually took. Remember that earlier I was talking about what are some of the commonalities across the idea pathogens. Start with a kernel of truth, and noble original goal. And another one exists. That each of those idea pathogens frees us from the pesky shackles of reality. They are liberating. Postmodernism liberates me from capital T truth. There is my truth. My lived experience. The prefix liberates me from the shackles of my biology and my genitalia. So the attractiveness from that liberation that provides the motive. If biology is useless, I don't need to know anything about it. Like social constructivism or other idea pathogens. Frees me from the shackles of realizing that I will never be, nor will my son, be the next Michael Jordan. As a social constructivism spouse originally by behaviorism, the quote, "Give me 12 children and I can make anyone a beggar or a surgeon or whatever," is basically saying that the unique socialization forces that constrain you in life, that don't turn you into the next MJ. There's nothing a priori that didn't start us all with equal potentiality. That's a lovely message. Two messages. 1. My subjective reality is the only reality. 2. Socialization can produce any outcome. That's a huge expansion of my potential power. I'm right by dint of my existence and the ability to modify the nature of reality without restriction. Exactly, and therefore it is hopeful. It frees me from shackles of the constraints of reality. I want to believe that any child that I could have produced could have genuinely had an equal probability of being the next MJ. It's also rooted in BS. All these idea pathogens shred the common desire for people to believe hopeful messages that are rooted in nonsense. Good time to stop. How it's going, your book? Comparing it to all possible books. It's a smashing success. I'm satisfied that more than anything, that you're better. Family's doing well. You're back on the saddle. Biggie hug. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to you. I felt that I know something more than I did when I started the conversation. Great conversation. We can dig into these topics endlessly and never get to the bottom fully. And maybe when your new book comes out, come to my show so we can discuss. If I'm in shape at that moment, it would be pleasure. And talk about role theory. Archetypes, I think, are biologically instantiated roles. Imagine a culture imagined an ideal. And imagine that people who approximated that ideal were more biologically fit as a consequence. They were more attractive. Which you would be if you embodied a true ideal. So over time the society would come to evolve towards its imagined ideal. So that makes a biologically instantiated archetype a very complicated thing. Because it starts in imagination, it ends instantiated in biology. And no one's ever come with a real mechanism for that. But that works. You posit an ideal. Then if you manifest it, you're more attractive. Then the ideal becomes something that evolution tilts toward. I agree, so maybe we won't have much to disagree about. Clear things up anyways. Solving disagreements. I look forward for that. Bye bye, take care.